Ray from the Australian team, and I'll be presenting qualified filling out the bottle. So it states that we need to get a vertical water jet and enter it into a bottle, and the sound may be produced. And we're going to investigate the properties of this sound and how they change and how these are affected by relevant parameters. So I'll be going through proof of concept, how sounds produce, the water flow, experimental setup, results, explanation, and conclusion. So, we can see as the bottle is filled up, there are bubbles here that are produced inside the water, and there are also disturbances on the surface. And so this is creating sound, and the sound is changing as the bottle is filled up. So, now going into producing sound. Sound is essentially produced when there is any disturbance in air, which is creating regions of high pressure and low pressure. So they're creating compressions and rarefactions. And this is the sound that travels out of the bottle and to our ears. So we'll be investigating what makes these compressions and rarefactions. So, if we take a bottle and it has some pressure P naught and some initial chamber volume V naught, and we make air come into the bottle, then there'll be some change in pressure inside of the bottle. There'll be compression that enters into the bottle, and the pressure will change. And this will create a force which acts upwards, which aims to oppose this change in pressure, which aims to push the air out. And so we can model this change in pressure with the change in volume which is occurring in the neck. This pushes the air out, which creates a decrease in pressure, which creates a force which aims to pull the air back in. And again, this change in pressure can be modeled with the change in volume in the neck. This is the concept behind the Helmholtz resonator, this oscillation in the pressure as the air is exiting and coming into the bottle. So given that pressure is a force per unit area, using Newton's second law, saying that the sum of the forces is proportional to the acceleration, we can find our change in pressure in the system, substitute it in, and this gives us a force balance which is similar to a simple harmonic oscillator. So that's telling us that this air is oscillating back and forth. And so the solution to this is some sine wave, which is telling us that this oscillation is creating a sound wave, and we can find the pressure. We can find the frequency, which is dependent on velocity and the dimensions and volume of the bottle. So with the surface of the bottle, if something is to hit the surface of the bottle itself, sound can be produced. And this is due to when something hits it, it displaces the bottle, which creates a restoring force due to the tensions inside the bottle, which causes the surface to oscillate back and forth. Due to the complex shape of the bottle, the exact frequency was not able to be modeled. The frequency of these vibrations was not modeled, but it was experimentally determined, as I'll show later on. So, another source of sound is a droplet, which enters into a bit of water with some speed v. When it enters, there's a splash of the water which goes over the droplet, and this creates an air bubble just above the droplet, which has some buoyant force aiming to pull it back up to the surface because there's a difference in the densities. Since there is a difference in the pressure inside the air bubble and inside the water, this means that there is a force which acts to change the volume of the bubble. If this pressure is greater inside than outside, then it aims to increase the volume. When the volume increases, then there is a decrease in pressure inside the bubble, which creates a force which acts to decrease the volume of the bubble. This creates oscillations of the bubbles, which can travel through the water and then eventually into the air. And so these oscillations of the bubbles are coming out as sound. So again, since these oscillations are occurring, aiming to bring it to some equilibrium, it can again be modeled like a harmonic oscillator, and it is being damped by the viscosity of the water, which will be investigated later on, how this viscosity will be changed with temperature. So with the water flow, we had some height of the water inside a container and then some opening of the bottle, and so then we can find the velocity of the water as it exits the bottle based on the height of the water. And then depending on what this velocity is, it can either be laminar, transitional, or turbulent. With laminar, when it enters the water, there is minimal disturbance of the water, and this results in no sound or minimal sound being produced. With transitional, there is some disturbance, and so we can hear sound inside the bottle. And with turbulent, there is a large amount of sound produced. So, with the parameters we tested bottle dimensions, so the volume and neck length to chamber ratio, and jet velocity, jet dimensions, and water temperature. So, with our experimental setup, we had a water container here which was filled up from the tap to some constant height, and then this was kept constant by having the tap constantly flowing into it. We had a microphone connected to Audacity to pick up the sound, and the bottle in here, the water was entering from these exiting points in the container, entering into the bottle. So with laminar flow, what we can see is that with laminar flow, we can see as the water enters the bottle, there are some disturbances on the water, but they are very minimal. We can see there's no bubbles produced under the water, and there's also no sound produced when this occurs. And so with bottle dimensions, we varied the volumes of the bottles, so same shape, larger volume, and with neck length, this chamber volume was changing, and also the length of this neck was changing. So with bottle dimensions, we had a prediction for the frequency of the air column due to the changes in pressure, and so as the volume increases, the rate of change of frequency decreases due to this larger volume constant flow rate. With the bubbles, we're predicting that the bubble frequency is independent of the volume because it's dependent on the oscillations of the bubbles, which isn't changed by the chamber that it enters. So with air column, here are our theoretical predictions, and we can see that as the volume is decreasing, we can see that it is reaching it is filling up faster, and so we're having these peaks as it reaches the peak of its flow rate, and it's occurring earlier with the small volumes. With our experiments, they closely matched up the initial parts. However, for the end, we can see that our experimental was slightly higher at this end phase where it peaks up in all of our experiments. This is consistency, so there is some missing part of our model which doesn't take into account what's occurring as the volume becomes very small. With the bottle structure, we found that when the water was initially entering the bottle, the initial droplets were exciting the bottle and causing it to emit its resonant frequency. And then after some time, roughly half a second, there was enough water in the bottle to completely dampen out this frequency, and it wasn't heard by the microphone. And then to verify whether this is the right frequency, we hit the bottle and measured the frequency of the bottle, and then compared this to our result, and we could see that there's a percentage difference of about 0.8%. So that means what we were measuring when the water was hitting the bottom of the bottle is in fact the resonant frequency of the bottle. With bubble frequency against volume, we can see that as the volume increases, there is no real change in the frequency. There's no increase change, and we can see that it is constant. With neck length to air column frequency ratio, with our theoretical predictions, we can see that although with our experimental values that we had, there wasn't a major change, but we're still able to investigate it due to the lack of the different materials available. And we can see that the experimental closely match up, but again, at this space here where the volume is getting very small, there is some difference. So with bubble dimensions, as volume increases, we can conclude that all of our predictions hold true except for the end of the increasing volume. With jet velocity testing, we increase this height of the water and this increases the amount of pressure, which increases the velocity as it exited. And so we predict that as the jet velocity increases, the rate of change in frequency increases because there's more flow. As jet velocity increases, the flow becomes more turbulent, and the change in and this would create some change in the bubble areas because there would be different amounts splashing over the water. However, this was not able to be predicted how much the turbulence of the water actually affects the bubble radius. But we can see when we measure the bubble radius by videoing it and finding the bubble radius which we could find, we could see that there was a close match between the bubble frequency against the jet velocity. So that means it is matching up with air column frequency against time. Again, we can see the rate of change is increasing, and with our experimental values, these are also matched up at the end. So we can conclude that these predictions hold. With jet dimensions testing, we increase the diameter of the jet through the different openings, and so we're predicting greater flow rate, greater rate of change frequency, and we can see with measuring the rate of diameter, it matches, and with the air column frequency against time, again, it is matching the rate of prediction. So the conclusions hold. With water temperature testing, we heat it in a bottle, place it in, and we measure the temperature against time. This manages to find the viscosity, and then so we can make our predictions, and so we have our air column frequency against time, which is good. And so we can see this discrepancy in the results. So,
okay. Sorry to interrupt there. 2 minutes time for questions from your product.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I have some questions. First, what do you think the sound source of the whole system? Sound source.
what is the sound source?
Yes.
So there's three I found: the bottle, the air column, and the bubbles.
So if there's no bubbles, can sound still be heard?
If there is disturbance on the water, yes.
If no bubbles, there's still sound. Okay. Then about the second question, have you done some investigation of the restrictions on Hampus resonance?
The restrictions.
Or Hampus resonance? Yes or no question?
No.
Okay. And the third question, how do you analyze the data from experiments?
So we had Audacity, which recorded spectrographs of frequency against time, and then we were able to take the frequency from that and plot it into.
Have you do any investigation about the loudness or timbre of the sound? Loudness and
intensity.
Yes.
This wasn't, no, it wasn't quantitatively investigated.
And we found that if the bottle is nearly to be filled up, can the resonance equation still be used?
If the
Bottle is nearly to be filled up, can the resonance equation still be used?
it appears through the experimental results that no, there is an error as the volume is.
And in your analysis of bubbles, how do you measure the radius, and what do you think is the specific influence of bubbles?
So we had the video of it entering, and we were able to measure the length with the tracker, and that means that we could.
So you use a camera to record the whole motion?
Yeah.
But do you think the sound difference caused by the camera because of the camera?
Yes.
So we don't think the bubble radius is very effective, and that's my question. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. 3 minutes time for preparation of your position. Okay, please start your position.
Hello everyone, welcome to from Team China, and I'm going to opponent problem number 5. First, let's review the problem. The keywords are vertical or Japanese properties of sound. We haven't been fully discussed of the properties, and the dimensions and the variables mentioned in the problem haven't been fully investigated. And in the presentation contents, first we give the presentation review. He presented the problem has come with some properties, but it's incomplete. And in the experiments part, we can see significant phenomenon, although the video cannot be played well, and in theoretical analysis, he used a resonance model, but we don't know the restrictions for this, so we don't think it's an improper approximation. And in the experiments part, he quantitatively investigated some ROUND3 jet. We don't think it's very effective to control variables. And I think you could test more parameters about shape of the model, and you could need to further condition of resonance and Hamilton's resonance. And he do interactive investigation on the water jet situation and air bubbles. But he says that if there's no air bubbles, there's still be some produced, which we disagree, and we will do further investigation in the discussion part. And he has measured the radius of the air bubble. However, there will be some difference caused by the camera. The image will not be the actual radius of the bubble, so we don't think this kind of presentation is effective. And he said unless there is no quantitative self-consistency to the theory part. Now, here is advices for the blue reporter. First, in the theory part, you should consider deeper physics about the properties of the sound, like the intensity, and if you need to do more comprehensive understanding of the sound source, then investigate all possible and reasonable vibrations. And in the choosing of resonance models, you need to do more comprehensive understanding of the model you choose and learn about these restriction conditions like the wavelength or the shape of the neck, and you need to do explanation on more parameters. In the experiments part, we suggest to investigate more variables and improve the experimental sets. To investigate air bubbles, influence on the water jet, and choose more types of bubbles. And now we can come to our discussion part.
Excellent.
First, let's come to the problem proceeding. First, the problem mentioned we need to investigate the properties of sound. What do you think about this?
It's asking us to investigate frequency and amplitude as you.
And you're not focused on the frequency part, right?
Yes. The thing is with the amplitude, it was more difficult to experimentally determine. But definitely there are effects of things like increased water velocity does increase the amplitude of the sound.
You can draw the frequency spectrum and then analyzing the intensity of sound tutorial transmission part. Okay, and in the experiment, it's mentioned a bottle. What do you find? That it can fit your experiment part, can fit your theory part about resonance, of a helpless resonance.
With our definition of a bottle is something with a neck, as bottles have, and then some main chamber.
So do you think that the neck play a role of a comparatively restricted input?
The neck.
Yes, the neck. It's a kind of comparatively restricted input.
So the neck does change the properties of the sound.
If the neck is too large, the area of the neck is too large, can the system still figure Hamilton's resonance?
So are you saying if the neck is, say, the same diameter as the chamber?
Larger but maybe smaller than this. It's much larger than the one you use in the past.
No.
So have you done investigation about the restrictions of Hamilton's resonance?
There definitely are restrictions. If it is the same size as the air column, then it will be, as the chamber, then it will be like an air column.
This part would suggest you can learn more about the restrictions, about the modeling you set up in the experiments part. And the sectional area of the neck is definitely much smaller than the 1.5 squares of the volume of the chamber. And we think you can do further investigation about the comparatively restricted.
There is investigation of the dimensions of the neck. However, a bottle itself, as it says it stated, is going into a bottle. A bottle is not something where the neck is the same diameter as the chamber.
And the bottle has a restriction of comparatively restricted, and the haircut model can only fit some kind of situations. We think you need further investigation.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And we come to the second question now. What do you think the sound source for the whole system?
The sound is produced from different sources in the system. So that I went through the three main different sources that were investigated: the bottle itself, the disturbance of the wood, which creates this airflow in and out,
So what?
and the bubbles, which can vibrate and also travel through the soil.
When the water jet is the surface, the kind of vibration cause. And when the air bubbles is produced, the vibration becomes stronger. And do you think that if there's no air bubbles, the vibration still be strong enough to provide the vibration of the whole system?
So laminar flow was investigated, and that results in no air bubbles being produced, and so
Yeah,
there's
do you
minimal
think that the air bubbles is the more direct reason for this system?
The air bubbles do create the most amount of vibration on the surface, but if there is some vibration on the
Okay, I
surface,
understand,
sound can
and-
still be produced.
Okay, I understand. I think the air bubbles is very nice source of vibration. And about the resonance model, what do you know about the boundary conditions for Hammond's resonance? And do you know the basic physics behind this model?
So the boundary conditions did not need to be determined because, as we can see, the boundary conditions will affect this phase constant here, whereas we're actually just looking for the frequency, which is dependent on what we calculate when we were modeling it. So the frequency is not strictly dependent on the boundary conditions, it's just the phase of the
Maybe you know that Hammond's resonance is a very ideal condition, but in your own experiment, first I don't think the neck condition for your mid-phase volume, mid-phase condition for Hammond's resonance. Besides, have you done correction for any effect? For any effect? Like see, when you measure the length of the neck,
so
have you done any corrections?
There is no end correction, but I do understand that yes, there is an exact point where it is reflecting off the exact edge. There is some plus or minus.
We can consider
amount.
wave motion in the system, but like when the wave is produced in the neck, it will definitely stop before the open, but not exactly the opening place. And there is the need to do any correction for the whole motion, I think.
So yes, error is of course taken into account. We can see that there is some error in the experiment. So definitely it is an approximation and not a perfect model. And this
So
was
we
pointed
need
out.
to end correction for this whole system. And have you known the restrictions about the wavelength and the dimension of the neck?
The wavelength.
Yes.
Well, if there's a low enough frequency, the wavelength is larger than the length of the neck. Then
When you
of course,
choose the frequency that the wavelength needs to be much larger than the dimensions of the model. Okay, then we can come to the experiment part. First, in analysis of data, do you draw the frequency spectrum?
do I draw the frequency spectrum?
And like the sound about both the frequency and the loudness and all the sound produced. Like we found that you basically analysis the rising frequency and the notes, but you can't see very direct presentation of this.
I'm sorry, I don't understand. Are you saying did I draw the actual spectrograph?
Yes.
So I do have this is an example of the one with the
I
hidden
don't
one.
think this.
So I do have
If you take the x-axis as the frequency, while at the time and the y-axis as the frequency, you actually draw a rising line for the frequency part, and there will be bubbles in this kind of area as the noises part. And I don't think you do an effective presentation of data to show us that you have really done experiments and analysis of data. Okay.
I'm just going to take some experiment, open up the Audacity file.
Okay. Sorry, we can discuss this maybe later in this part. And I want to ask further questions about the dimensions of the water jet.
We can see the change in the frequency over
It's
time.
very nice. So it's I think the complicated spectrum, how do you analyze this kind of part? Have you reduced the noises through kind of some analysis?
Which have I
Reduce the
reduced
noises.
it?
You already find the most obvious rising frequency.
So that there wasn't any reduction of the noise, but definitely there was noise. And
So we
you can
think
see
you can do improvement in your data analysis part.
when you do the Fourier transform in this,
Yes.
you can see the peaks, and so the visual peaks here. So there is some
And this kind of very complicated spectrum, and we can't find the most direct one for the system, and we think you can improve your data analysis. And we come to the variables of the experiments. First of all, the jet velocity and jet dimensions. The water jet velocity and water jet dimension influence the whole system.
So how do that?
Yes, like when you change the velocity of the water, I think that you change the outlet height of the water, right?
So the way we changed velocity is we increased this height of the water here, so there's an increase in pressure here,
Yes.
so then there's an increase in the velocity as
Have
it
you
exits.
investigated the motion, the velocity of the, or the motion of the water jet before the end of the bottle? That because of the air, the water cannot always remain a constant situation, but they may also break up or some kind of different situations.
So it was assumed that the water coming out was transitional to turbulent flow. So then that's what's creating these droplets and the inconsistencies in flow, which creates the splashes and hence the bubbles in the water and these vibrations. So definitely there are inconsistencies, and that's what allows the phenomenon to occur.
So we think that when you change the water velocity, you're definitely changing the dimensions and also the motion of the water jet. So we think we should do further investigation because this will influence a lot about the air bubbles and the sound intensity. Then can you just show me something about when you're changing the water temperature?
Temperature. Yeah, so apologies. So
You can explain that how the water temperature will influence the whole system.
So, water temperature, an increase in water temperature means a decrease in viscosity. So that means there's a decrease in amount
You
of
think
drag
it's
force
on-
in the
is it-
water. So
do you
the
think
bubbles
it's
are
on the-
high frequency.
Do you think the temperature of water will influence the temperature of the air, the whole chamber?
So in the tested range, the change in temperature of the air isn't significant enough to change the velocity of sound, so there's no
So
significant.
you just think the
Sorry
temperature?
to interrupt you there. There's no
Okay.
more time for additional remarks. Please go on with your summary.
Now we'll give the opponent's conclusion part. First, about the report, the reporter don't know any restriction for Hancock's resonance, but we think that they need to fit very strict condition in order for the the magma to be much smaller than the volume of the chamber. And in the experiments part, I don't think it gave very effective presentation of data about the analysis of frequency spectrum, and I don't think an analysis of the noises produced in his spectrum part. And in the experimental variables part, I think his way of changing the water jet is not so effective, and we suggest further investigation about when changing the water jet, what is definitely changing? Its intensity of vibration or the air or the influence of the air column. And when he changed the air, when he changed the temperature of the water, he think he only changed the viscosity, but we think it also influence about the surface tension, and we suggest to do further investigation. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 3 minutes time for questions, right? Review.
Thank you. To the reporter, is the radius of every single bubble be the same if we use the same jet to angle the bottle?
No, definitely.
Okay, thank you. Then to both of you, do you think it's as suitable to model the sound with only a single frequency? No, not suitable. Reporter, suitable. or not?
Is there only a single?
Is that suitable to model the sound only with a single frequency? No? Okay. Then how does to the reporter, how does turbulence create sound by bubbles?
So the turbulence, this inconsistency in the water flow, which when it enters the water creates splashes, which
So
creates
is that by bubbles?
Is that the-
Turbulence creates sound by bubbles.
yes, and disturbance of the
Okay,
water.
thank you. Then to the reporter again, how does the jet transform to the droplet?
That was the
How does the jet transform to a
how
droplet?
the jet transform into a droplet. So there's the turbulence. There are natural just droplets in turbulent flow.
Okay, but what is the threshold? Thank you. Then to both of you, does vibration created by water passing through the neck of the bottle or by other oscillations?
Oscillations of the water and the bubbles.
Okay, then
I think that the oscillation of the water surface and bubble produced is made by vibration force, but the water jet in the bottle is kind of disturbance for the whole vibration system.
okay. Then to both of you, do you think two bottles with the same volume but different shape create different sound? Yes. With same volume but different shape of the bottle.
Well, look, if you want to fit his model or have his resonance, the capital's shape will not influence the whole system, but the shape of the neck will influence.
Shape of the neck will influence, but shape of the bottle won't
If we
influence.
want to fit his theory model about
So
the
do you
capital's
think?
resonance.
So do you think the shape, same volume with different shape of bottle will influence or not?
Same volume.
Same volume of the bottle of different shape.
Oh, you mean same volume of the chamber you mentioned? That's if it can fit the restrictions for Ham's residents to go down.
Okay, thank you. Then to the reporter, do you think modeling the shape of bottle more quantitatively is important as well?
It was measured quantitatively, and yes, it is important.
Okay, then back to the turbulence part. So can you further explain how the turbulence created this sound?
So the inconsistency of the water flow enters the water in the bottles, it splashes and
What
creates
is the
disturbance.
inconsistency?
Okay, sorry, time's up. 2 minutes time for preparation of the review.
So good morning everyone. I'm the reviewer from Team Taiwan. Today I'll be reviewing problem number 5, Philadelphia bottle. And here's the problem statement. The main focus will be on what the sound is produced and how the properties of sound change in the constitution and relevant parameters. And here's the reporter's outline. The report did good on, he gave us a qualitative explanation, but no clarification for sound level or frequency distribution. And in the third part, he used the common called first and a year model, and he did good on, he gave us a clear relationship explained, but he did well on third theoretic model derivation for bubble vibration. And in the experiment part, he did good on, he has explained some difference between theory and experiments, but he did not do well on poorly drawn graphs, couldn't compute results, and he didn't explain all graphs. And here's the opponent presentations. The opponent presentation is mainly about this part, and the process that the opponent questions limit of the theory, and she mentions the intensity and frequency of sound as properties, and she did good on investigate sound source, but he did not say why all times is important and did not analyze reporter's data. She did not mention more parameter, but doesn't say what. And then here's the discussion on the topic, which I think that we can model the shape as simple shapes combined and calculate the vibration frequency with Newton's law and exotic compression, but the model doesn't work if volume is too small or neck is too thick. And then this is the discussion on sound sources, but I think that there's no verification of the reporter's opinion, and he could try to produce bubble with syringe only observe sound from bubbles, and or tapping the bottle to know whether the frequency of it. And here's the discussion on the sound properties, which I think that we cannot use only specific frequency to analyze the sound, but we need a spectrum for frequency like the opponent just mentioned. And here's the discussion on the water temperature, which the opponent simply asks questions and the reporter answers when temperature viscosity goes down. But there's no clear explanation of how frequency gets lower or change of the amplitude. And here's the point which the single bubble radius formed by jet won't be the same. So there should do a spectrum for the distribution of for the size of the bubbles. And we cannot model the sound with only a single frequency, which we need distribution and amplitude of the spectrum. And there's inconsistency of turbulence, possibly from the surface wave from the jet, and which they clearly explain about the rayline instability and its breakout through length, which is the turbulence create the sound. And the bottle with same volume but different shape should have different properties, not as the reporter just answered my questions. And we should have even more quantitative model, which is the reporter presentation lack of. And we can simplify model by simple geometric shape, which on the investigation of the shape of the bottle. Thank you. This is the end of my presentation.
Thank you. 2 minutes time to review more by the reporter.
So thank you for the good opposition and critique from the reviewer. So it was addressed the limits of the bottle. I understand that there are limits as the neck dimensions change, but we know a bottle is something where the neck is a lot thinner than the chamber. Something where the neck is the same size as the chamber is more of a cup than a bottle. The errors were addressed and in the presentation and how they differ towards the end as the volume gets very small. And we acknowledge that amplitude should be tested, however the difficulties with measuring as it was very inconsistent between tests. But we do acknowledge it's important in investigating the properties of sound. It was measured, the shape, volume, temperature, jet velocity, and jet dimensions were all tested, and 3 different frequencies were investigated for every one of these parameters. And it was mentioned that the spectrum of frequencies should have been seen. The spectrum of frequencies was seen on the spectrograph, however these were separated in the presentation for visualization so it doesn't look like a clutter of all of these frequencies, so we could investigate individually how these frequencies change. And so we acknowledge that also bubble radius is not constant for every single bubble that enters the bottle. Varying bubble radii changes the frequency, and this was seen. However, there are an average number of large bubbles which were picked up. The smaller bubbles, much higher frequencies, weren't picked up on the spectrograph and also had much lower amplitudes, so those large bubbles investigated. Yeah, so overall the problem was investigated and fulfilled. All of the variables were investigated and all of the frequencies were investigated. Thank you.
Thank you. And we move on to jury questions. I'd like to go ahead, if you don't mind. First, to the reporter. The Helmholtz model requires a spherical oscillator, right?
A spherical oscillator.
Yeah. A spherical model.
Yeah, so it's not exactly.
Okay, so if I took a bottle like this, what would be the neck length in your model?
In my model, it would be the top. However, a bottle like that.
So this one.
Yeah, it is. That's an inaccurate shape in terms of using a Helmholtz resonant. The one in the video was seen with a much larger chamber and a much more clear neck. So those bottles were used rather than these.
So you see, it doesn't apply to bottles like this.
There is more error with bottles like that.
Yeah, Jacob?
Yeah, so question for the opponent. So you mentioned that the Helmholtz resonance model was insufficient, or was inappropriate. What would be a better resonance model? Can you, so what's the main physical limitation of the Helmholtz model here?
We think the Helmholtz resonance can be used, but we need to add further rectifications for the whole system. Like when we consider the length of the neck, we need to consider the end effect of the system, like the neck may be longer than the actual length. And if you want to use the model, the volume of the chamber and sectional area of the neck need to fit certain conditions, like the constricted neck need to be much smaller than the bottom part.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jacob, once
Yeah,
again.
and so question to the reviewer. So you mentioned that only looking at the single frequency was inadequate, and so how would you expect the spectrum to look like? Are we supposed to look at some general structure? What would you extract from the spectrum rather than looking at a single peak?
Well, I think that there may be some overtones of the frequency. So first of all, that's something that we should investigate about. Because the overtones might be different when you change the shape of bottles, and also the sharpness of the frequencies, the Q values might be different, related to the velocity of the jet, because even the jet velocity is really big, then the disturbance on the surface of the water will change, so the volume inside or the length of the bottle, the air column will change, so the frequency will change.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mark.
So I've clearly seen the opposite, that there were like several overtones as mentioned now. Do you have any theoretical explanation for them? How are they created?
So with these pressure oscillations in the bottle, yes, they're overtones because there are multiples of which these can oscillate at, so they're natural.
So are those the tones that are created by bubbles or by Helmholtz resonance or by the resonance of the
Helmholtz resonance.
So these are just from the Helmholtz resonance, those overtones.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
I'd like to redirect that question to you. Can you briefly state your opinion on the overtones and the origin?
The overtone is experiments.
The overtones when doing the experiment and their origin.
Okay. If we want to draw the frequency spectrum, depends on, you mean the timbre of the system or
The overtones we've seen in the spectrum.
Okay, if we draw the frequency spectrum first, the kind of rising frequency line, and on the upper place there will be kind of noises because of the air bubbles produced like thousands of hertz. And if you find that the rising lines may be more than one, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. We think that for any kind of resonance there will be multi-frequency. That's the number of waves in whole resonance is not a single one. Maybe it considers the basic frequency, the active frequency, and when we change there will be the multi-frequency will be much smaller, I think. And if we do many kind of other investigations, it might be seen on the spectrum.
Okay. Yes, Jacob?
Yes. So to the reporter, so you measured the bubble frequency. Yes. How did you measure the bubble frequency? How was it collected experimentally?
It comes up on the spectrograph, but since there's varying bubble radio, there is a large error as well. Like you can see on the graphs, there's plus or minus 100 hertz. So you can see it consistent throughout the entire test. There's this one frequency that goes across.
So
I'm sorry, time's up. We shouldn't ask questions for more than 5 minutes. So, if you don't mind, yeah, that's viewers. Maybe active viewers. So we start by showing our marks for the reporter. It's 3, 3, 4, 4, and 6. For the opponent, it's 9, 5, 7, 7, 7. And for the reviewer, it's 5, 5, 7, 7, 6. Yeah. So there's two low threes on the report, one by Martin, please.
Sure. So my partial grades were 2, 3 quarters and minus 1 for some answers. I think even though you've done some experiments, you try to do some theoretical explanation of the phenomena that create the sound. I don't think that you actually analyze them thoroughly. Let's start, for example, for the theory. I wasn't convinced that your theory actually predicted all sounds that you saw there. I don't think that your explanation of the harmonies was correct. And also, like, to get higher marks, I would expect some more, more quantitative predictions, for example, for the bubble oscillations. That's the thing that, you can do, or for example, the bottle vibration sound. Those are the things that you can either measure separately or estimate roughly. And these estimates would bring you much higher. Also, the comparison between theory and experiment was, for me, very weak, because I couldn't really, you said that it doesn't fit at the end, but from the graph, it really wasn't convincing for me that your theory and experiments all are sort of played out together. For discussion, I get 3 quarters because I don't think that it was efficient, and your answers didn't bring me any really light to your presentation.
Okay. High 6 by Susan.
I thought he'd done some good experimental work, which was impressive to see was done adequately. I thought you did the discussion well. Yes, there was definitely things that were missing out of it, but I think you had some good jobs on. I was 26.
I am.
Sure.
So I was in between with a 4. So what I respect a lot of the Helmholtz part of this, because yeah, so you do the Helmholtz and then you try to connect that to experiments, and I think you do that section well, and you stand by it. And I also respect that you say, okay, this section doesn't really fit. You don't try to alter or mix with anything, but like, okay, the theory seems to be slightly insufficient here. My problem is if we talk on the experiment on the bubble, this bubble frequency. So if you extract things with some kind of complex procedure from a spectrum, there needs to be spectrum so that we see how that procedure actually carried out. I have some concerns how that procedure actually worked out and how that was possible. And it was very hard to actually evaluate that since we saw very little spectrums in the presentation. So if the data analysis section had been much clearer, I would have been able to get higher. But thank you for the presentation.
Okay, for the opposition, low 5 by Martin again.
Yeah. So the result got slightly below 5.5 to be more clear. I think you had several nice points there, but I didn't like that you didn't actually push the reviewer to bring some conclusions from your point. So for example, you started talking about the full spectrum, but I don't think that you actually got into the point that you would ask him to actually, draw some conclusions from that. There are we want to see some comparison with theory and experiment, and you should probably, I would push a bit more for the theory and try to compare the predictions for the theory to the full spectrum that was kind of analyzed, but not much. So I saw a bunch of topics, and I would prioritize them a bit differently, and I would change and the conduct was for me, you were just going through the topics very quickly, and for me it didn't leave a good impression in the sense that I saw some kind of a similar approach yesterday. I was consistent with myself, that's why I needed to bring it down 5.4, which went down to 5.
Okay. Being on the other end of the scale, with giving it 8, I must say that I was obviously very impressed by the opposition. This is the best opposition I've seen so far in this tournament. This happens sometimes because after the report, I was thinking myself, okay, how would I oppose the problem? And when the opposition mostly does how you would do it yourself, this is how you end up with a mod like this, because I felt like in comparison to Martin, or in contradiction to Martin, your points very well prioritized. I guess I would have done it pretty much like the same. I felt that the questions, like the opponent questions, were aimed at resolving unclear points in the presentation rather than asking things that would more or less belong to the discussion. So I added 1.5 for the questions. I added 3 for the presentation, which I found clearly structured and addressing most of the weaknesses of the report. And I added the highest mark of the partials, 3.5 for discussion, because I like your way of stating your own idea when actually making the point. And I like you clearing up the point on how the spectrum would actually look over time, because I think that is key to the overall phenomenon. Like if we think of the bubble filling up a bubble, the key phenomenon is that we hear a rising frequency over time, and I really estimate clearing that up. So it's 1.5, 3, 3.5, which adds up to a 9 on my sheet.
I give a 7 slightly lower than the firm, but and I subscribe to almost anything being said. The only thing I would like to mention is that sometimes you had some vagueness in that you said, a better theory could be required, or a better experimental procedure could be. If you had been more clear on what you more specifically expected, because we can always say this, we would have liked to see something better, but just be a little more clear on that, and would have been absolutely perfect.
Yeah, that's basically my point slightly as well, that I would like to hear more specific in the discussion.
Okay, reviewer, 2 low 5s, 2 high 7s. So low 5s by Martin and me. Let's see. Yeah, I think that the reviewer questions were somewhat both fully relevant and, to my opinion, not so relevant. So I think the question had strengths and weaknesses. This is why I added 1 out of 2 for questions. However, I found that the review of the report was too positively oriented. I mean, this is obviously influenced by how I see the report and how I see the opposition, and I would then judge you on your opinion, how you judge them. I mean, this is a general problem of the review as such, and obviously as I like the opponent pretty much, and you then come up criticizing the opponent right away, this is certainly a point that I would not agree to. So this is partially influenced by that. So I added 1 out of 3 for the review of the report, as I think that you missed to address some of the basic shortcomings that were left over by the opponent. I added 1 out of 3 for the review of the opposition, for the reasons I've been stating. And I added 1 out of 2 for the discussion analysis. I didn't feel like I could subtract or add anything for mispoints, as the questions contained good mispoints and rather ones that were not so important. So adding up 1, 1, and 1, that is a let's see, 1, 1, and so 1 for questions, 1 for report, 1 for opposition, 1 for discussion. That is a 5 for my sheet. High mark of 7 by Jacob. Maybe Daniela. We've had just a few questions.
I gave 1 point for questions, but 1.5 and 1.5 for review of the report of the review of the opposition, because I think you mentioned a lot of missing things, and the most important things was mentioned in the review. So I gave 1.5 and 1.5 review.
Okay.
What I really liked was that in the end, when I got asked to clarify that the overtone structure was brought in. Because to me, this is not only about the first harmonic, the first the tone we hear, but also about that there is an overtone spectrum.
Okay. If there is no more justification needed, we'll take a short break and be back in 5 minutes, please. Thank you.